Hello and welcome to the first of my reviews Redux. These are videos in which I go back to reviews I've already done and basically update them to my current quality standard, because my current quality standard is way higher than it used to be. In fact, with this particular review, YouTube hadn't actually implemented videos longer than 15 minutes, so I had to split this into two parts and it was just janky. And on top of that, the recording quality was pretty terrible, so I decided to go back to it and redo this particular review in my current style. And of course, if there have been any changes in the game's status since then, I can certainly talk about those. And I figured that since I was reviewing Bad Company 1, it would be a good idea to go back and take another look at Bad Company 2, and of course see what it did better and what it retained from the previous Bad Company game. Of course, what you're seeing here is the PC version, only this time it's in 1080p, maxed out, as far as I can do anyway, because I did have one very nasty issue with this game, which I will get to in a moment. But to recap on what Bad Company 2 is, it is a first-person shooter that was originally released in March of 2010 for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3, and it later saw a release on iOS and Kindle Fire, if you can believe that. I honestly had a hard time believing it until I looked it up myself, and it looks pretty terrible on Kindle Fire and iOS, so why anyone would play that version is utterly beyond me, especially considering that first-person shooters just don't work on a touch screen. But anyway, this was developed by DICE and published by EA, and this was one of those games where they had started to screw around with the business model. With this one, they introduced something called the VIP program, which was basically a season pass that was released for Xbox 360 and PS3. PC players, on the other hand, got it for free, and they also implemented something called the Veteran program, which was available in the previous Bad Company game as well, although I never got it working properly. And that's basically where people who owned previous Battlefield games could actually register that with EA, and they would be given some free in-game content. In this particular case, you got the M1 Garand. But that was it, unlike the VIP pass, which got you map packs. Again, that was free on PC, so the PC got free map packs, but the consoles didn't. And that's not exactly fair, except the problem with that was that EA, of course, saw dollar signs when they made Battlefield 3, and they started doing Season Pass stuff from there on out. It's been a complete mess since then. So I guess you can see this as the final hurrah for free map packs on PC as far as the Battlefield series goes. But it's also kind of the turning point in the series gameplay as well, when it became less about actual combined arms warfare and less about teamwork and more about getting a bunch of unlocks so you're just straight up better than the other players. And while I'll get to that in a moment, the first thing I really need to address is the presentation. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the original Bad Company ran on the original version of the Frostbite engine, and Bad Company 2 runs on Frostbite 1.5. This also went on to power Medal of Honor 2010's multiplayer, and it also powered Battlefield 1943 if you've played that, but I'm not going to be covering that because it's console only, and, well, currently my Xbox is dead. In case you're wondering about how I actually managed to do the Bad Company 1 video, it was actually made before the Xbox crapped out, so there you go. At any rate, this is an updated, improved version of the Frostbite engine, although they didn't quite improve everything, mostly just visuals and physics simulation. And it definitely looks a hell of a lot better than Bad Company 1 did, and that's in no small part due to the fact that they released it on PC and gave us all the bells and whistles to toy with. Of course, this does bring with it its fair share of problems. They went quite overboard on the bloom lighting, so it absolutely blinds you half the time. And there's also a ridiculous amount of particle effects, namely dust, that will get in your way and make it extremely hard to see what you're doing. Which is a shame, because once you get past that, the texture quality for what generation of consoles it was really made for is actually pretty impressive, and the modeling in particular is rather well done. Characters look great. Weapons look pretty good. The problem there being the animations generally are pretty crap. I mean, the first-person assault rifle animations when you try to reload are quite literally just removing the magazine, sticking another one in, and smacking it no matter what you're doing. My guess is that people complained about how long the reloads were in Bad Company, and so they shortened them in Bad Company 2, and just kind of said, screw realism, we don't really care. Although this does translate into some amusing glitches here and there, like the red dot sight not appearing on the assault assault rifles, when you switch over to your grenade launcher, it just disappears. Although this seems to be only an issue on PC, it's more a mild annoyance than anything else. You're not using the red dot sight when you've got the grenade launcher out anyway, but it's still mildly annoying that they didn't fix it. And there's other glitches as well. I mean, you might have seen my video of Dice Doesn't Pay Attention, in which I showed off the USAS-12 shotgun reload animation just always being able to be triggered no matter what. I showed off the bug where someone activates their parachute and then when they land it doesn't go away, so it's just kind of floating above them. Things like that just kind of take you out of the experience, but they're not game breaking or anything like that, unless of course you're the poor sod who happens to be the one that the parachute glitch applies to. Then you just stick out like a sore thumb and you're really easy to spot. But luckily that's not the most common of bugs, so it's pretty rare that that happens to you. But then there's the other problems you'll run into with the visuals that are either baffling or are just incredibly irritating. The irritating bit is the FOV. By default, it's extremely low, something like 55 degrees in vertical, which, depending on your monitor resolution, can be downright atrocious. I changed mine up to basically be equivalent to a horizontal FOV of 110, which is infinitely more comfortable on a widescreen monitor. If you're running a 4x3 monitor, basically you go with the standard PC FOV, which is 90 degrees. But there are a couple of problems with changing the FOV. The first of them is just that it's a mild annoyance. You have to go to the config file and manually alter the FOV, and you have to do a calculation via a FOV calculator in order to figure out exactly what FOV you're going to be typing in there. But again, that's a mild annoyance. The other problem, and the one that's really the big problem, is that the FOV change only applies to the multiplayer. You cannot change your single player FOV at all without basically using an external program, and thus if you're like me and you had problems with the FOV in Bad Company 1 or just low FOVs in general, it is going to make you nauseous. I cannot play the single player in this for longer than a stretch of about 10 to 15 minutes, which of course makes me glad that I finished the single player campaign before I did the original review, and thus I didn't have to go through the whole thing here. But suffice to say, that did make getting footage from the single player campaign rather problematic, because I just couldn't stand to do it for very long, and on top of that, there's some issues with the single player that I'll get to in a moment. Once again, I have no idea how you console players put up with such ridiculously low FOVs. At any rate, the visuals are generally rather good and actually still hold up pretty well, except for one really major problem, and this has only popped up in retrospect when you're trying to play it on more modern hardware. Unfortunately, there is just some weird issue with the way this is programmed, such that I had to do quite a lot of fiddling to get this thing to actually work. It's not like I'm running some arcane system here. I'm running a GTX 970, 16 gigs of RAM, and an i7-4790K. Obviously, that's ridiculously overkill for this particular game. I mean, I get basically 200 plus FPS at all times, but that's not the problem. The problem is that when I tried to boot this thing up in full screen mode, it refused to load. So I looked around online and I found out that this is actually a fairly common issue with current hardware and current drivers and such, and it's been this way for years now. Unfortunately, that means you have to run it in windowed mode to get it to work at all. Even worse, you have to load it in DirectX 9 mode, which means that you don't get any of the advanced graphics features, which is why you're not seeing this completely maxed out. I can only get it to work properly in DirectX 9 mode in windowed mode, which in turn led to some weird issues with regards to recording, because I normally use Shadowplay now, and Shadowplay only works if you do full screen or if you record the desktop, which meant I had to get an external program to get this thing to run in borderless windowed. It was a mess. So fair warning, EA dropped support of it, and the various driver updates for, I believe, both AMD and NVIDIA, not just NVIDIA, because that's what I'm running, have basically left this thing behind. So you need to do a bit of fiddling to get it to work properly. But anyway, now that the visuals are out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the sound design, which in some respects is pretty fantastic, and in other respects, not so much. Let's face it, when it comes to the sounds of warfare, DICE is pretty much unparalleled. And so when the battle is going full swing, the absolute carnage going on around you, it sounds fantastic. Things are blasting apart, you got the distant crack of gunfire. Whenever there's a rifle shot, it's always a supersonic crack. It sounds great. And then you step down a bit when you go to the voice acting, which is still good, it's just not anywhere near as good as the sounds of Carnage of Warfare. The battle chatter works rather well with that, but when you go to the actual campaign, the voice acting is just kind of bland and uninteresting for the most part. Although that's mostly from the script more than the actual voice acting. And then you go to the music, which is easily the weakest part of the sound design, mostly due to the vast majority of tracks being completely forgettable. The only one that actually sticks in my mind is the main Battlefield Bad Company 2 theme, which unfortunately sounds like a generic war movie track when you really get down to it, and that's something that the soundtrack suffers from in general. It just sounds like a generic war movie soundtrack more than anything else, and thus it just leaves you going, meh. And speaking of meh, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. Meh, of course, applying to the entirety of the single-player campaign. It actually starts you out as a World War II commando who's going on a special mission into a Japanese base in order to extract a defecting scientist who is working on a ridiculously powerful weapon. Of course, this is mostly set up for the later parts of the game when you're actually playing as Preston Marlowe and you're going around with your same squad that you had in Bad Company 1. But the way this mission unfolds is that it starts off telling you that there is a legend about these World War II commandos on this mission, and this is the real story. And it plays out pretty much like you would expect a Michael Bay movie. Lots of explosions, lots of completely nonsensical gibberish, and so little historical accuracy you can't help but kind of chuckle at it. I mean, to give you an idea, they have the Japanese using M1 Garands with the Imperial Chrysanthemum stamped on them instead of the normal US markings, because they're that lazy. I mean, really, they could splurge for the Thompson and the M1 Garand because they are in the actual multiplayer, but we can't have the Japanese actually using Arisaka rifles like they actually would. Way to live up to the expectation of being more realistic than Call of Duty there, DICE. At any rate, the World War II mission shows you basically everything that is wrong with current FPSs. Constantly takes control away from you to have a cutscene. There's tons of scripted explosions and AI events and such like that. The enemy AI is incredibly stupid. I mean, all the single-player footage you're seeing in this video is on the hardest difficulty setting, so that should give you an idea. And it generally ends up being extremely underwhelming. Unfortunately, that underwhelming feeling never really goes away. It stays with you when you move into the actual main campaign, which is starring Preston Marlowe as he was in Bad Company, and his squad of misfits who are all fighting in Russia now to secure a similar device to the one that was sought after in the World War II mission. After that, they end up getting sent to contact a special agent and, in the process, uncover a plot regarding revenge, because of course it's revenge, we've got to be like Call of Duty, right? If you can't tell, I absolutely despise the single-player campaign. As I mentioned with the World War II level, it's pretty much everything that is wrong with current FPSs. Lots of taking control away from you, lots of complete nonsense, a story that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, and that you couldn't possibly give a crap about. Unfortunately, they didn't really learn anything from the previous game as well, in that the previous game was trying to be funny but failing miserably at it. So instead with this one, they just pretty much chucked that out the window and said, you know what, we're going to take this relatively seriously this time around. You occasionally get a quip here and there, but generally speaking, they don't even really try for humor this time around, and take it seriously, which actually makes things worse. So you end up with an absolutely terrible campaign that was pretty much just slapped together to actually have a single-player campaign as opposed to just having nothing. And mechanically, it's like every other modern military shooter on the market. You've got two main weapon slots, you've got your special weapons that you might be able to switch to, and that's pretty much it. You might go up to an objective in order to destroy it. You might go up to an objective and activate a button or something like that. Occasionally you'll be able to get into vehicles, but it's really just a standard modern military shooter campaign other than that. As you've no doubt noticed during this footage as well, the enemy AI is incredibly dumb. They'll just kind of stand around in the middle of the open, occasionally they'll throw a grenade at you, but that's about as smart as they get, because you can just mow them down incredibly easily, even on the hardest difficulty setting. In fact, the only thing that the hard mode really seems to do is make enemies do a bit more damage when they actually do manage to hit you. So the AI ends up being a complete pushover, making the gameplay itself incredibly easy, even with the somewhat wonky weapon handling that this thing has. And with the really crappy FOV, it ends up being way more trouble than it's worth. So it really does fall to the multiplayer to bring things up, and I mean, it's a Battlefield game, you'd pretty much expect that. The thing is, the original Bad Company had some very serious problems with regards to the multiplayer, one of which was the class system. You see, Battlefield Bad Company had 5 classes, of which only a couple were really that useful, and the specialized anti-vehicle class was pretty terrible because it had a shotgun, and shotguns were practically useless in that game. So this time around, they have shortened it to 4 classes. You have Assault, Recon, Engineer, and Medic. The Recon class is basically unchanged from Bad Company 1. They still use sniper rifles and handguns, they have motion sensors and such like that. The Assault class uses assault rifles with underslung launchers, which can be used in, of course, a grenade configuration, as well as an underslung shotgun firing flechette rounds, making it absolutely devastating to enemies up close, although the grenade launcher is still only useful for actually blasting holes in buildings and such like that, instead of actually attacking enemies, unless you have the explosives upgrade, but I'll get to that more in a moment. The Medic class uses machine guns and has the medic kit that it can drop, as well as a defibrillator to revive downed allies. The Engineer is basically what replaces the Demolition class. They have the anti-vehicle weapons, and they also get a drill that they can use to repair vehicles. Only this time, instead of being stuck with shotguns, they actually get the suppressed SMGs and carbines, which means that they're basically a combination of the Specialist class and the Demolition class from the original Bad Company. All in all, it's a better system than the previous game, except for one really nasty problem that comes up with this and the further games in the series. They implemented a pretty heavy unlock system. To give you an idea, the Assault class is your basic run-of-the-mill soldier. They start out with the AEK 971 assault rifle with the grenade launcher, unlocked by default. The first unlock they get is an ammo box drop at 1200 experience. Now admittedly, that's really not that hard to get to, but where things get a bit more crazy is when you get to things like the Medic. The Medic unlocks their med kit first at 1400 experience, and they don't get the defibrillator until 5800 experience. Which of course means that until they actually get those items, they're basically just some guy with a machine gun. And then there's the issue of the weapon unlocks. Each class has its own set of weapons that you unlock based on experience as well. And while the unlock system isn't quite as punishing as Battlefield 3 or Battlefield 4's unlock system, the stuff you start out with is objectively inferior to the stuff you can unlock later. For example, the Assault kit's first unlocked assault rifle, the XM8, is actually one of the better rifles in the entire game, with the absolute best assault rifle basically being the M416, unless you can actually get some accuracy going on with the AN94. The best overall sniper rifle in the game is the GOL Magnum, which you unlock third to last. And then you got things like the various vehicle unlocks, where you unlock various bonuses to your vehicles when you get in them. For example, you can get a perk that gives you a damage boost. There's another one that gives you armor upgrades. There's one that makes your reloads go faster. Things like that give you a marked advantage over newer players. This is a very, very poor way to handle unlocks. It means the game is objectively unbalanced. It's not a matter of getting better at the game the more you play it, it's a matter of newer players have objective disadvantages compared to older players. And this really does manifest once you get in-game. You'll find everybody running around with the same handful of weapons. All of the medics basically use the MG36 because it has a built-in red dot sight, making it straight up better than all the other LMGs that require you to give up a perk slot in order to take the red dot attachment, which is the same for pretty much everybody else. In fact, nobody else gets an integrated red dot sight. And really the only thing that sort of balances this kind of stuff out is the way the weapons handle. They have a decent amount of recoil, and it's not just so much the recoil, because that's really more in the animations than anything else. It's that they actually have a cone of fire, where the first few shots you make are going to be really accurate. The more you hold down the full auto, the more wide your shots are going to go horizontally in addition to vertically. So you do have to control your recoil by firing in bursts, which is something that most newer players aren't really used to, which means they're going to get curb stomped when the older players are just like, yeah, we've been doing this for a while now, so we know exactly how all these things handle. And that actually becomes fairly problematic in the long run because it's not just the unbalanced unlock system or the fact that there's a learning curve. If it were just a learning curve and it were just the unlock system, you could kind of work around that. But unfortunately, the game is simply not balanced at its core. Bad Company 1 suffered from a problem of the vehicles being kind of ridiculously overpowered, particularly the helicopters. Bad Company 2 suffers from the exact same problem, only it's compounded by the fact that you have vehicle-based perks now. So I hope you like spawning and immediately dying due to a guy in a helicopter camping your base. There are some servers that have rules against that, but it's really only enforced when there's actually admins on, which these days really isn't that often. So unfortunately, an enemy spawn camping your base is incredibly commonplace, and particularly with tanks and helicopters, because there's not too much you can do against them. Engineers' anti-vehicle weapons take multiple hits to bring down a tank, for example, and so you would need a concerted effort by everybody being an engineer on your team to actually take down a single tank, let alone multiple tanks. And when it's against helicopters, well, just good luck with that. About the only thing you can actually take down a helicopter with is another helicopter, unless you just get ridiculously lucky, or you've gotten insanely good at leading your targets with the rather slow-moving rockets. Vehicles also present another problem with the rush mode in particular, because the vehicles can be used to destroy the MCOM stations, which makes it really easy for the attackers to win. Not to mention, snipers can just hang back and call in mortar strikes on said MCOM stations to destroy them more easily, because you basically just collapse the building on the particular MCOM station, and it destroys it, which means that you don't have to send in your guys to plant a charge on it and then give the enemy the ability to disarm the charge. So that becomes quite a big problem and also brings up the destructible environments in this thing. It is possible to level pretty much every building on the map in this thing. So by the end of a particularly long conquest match, you can actually end up with a map where every single building on it has been completely flattened and there's no cover left, which of course means you are easy pickings for anything and everything, which gets pretty irritating. So actually the destructible environments, despite being touted as a huge feature of it, end up being more of a detriment than an actually good thing. They're good in the sense of, sure, you can blast a hole in the wall and get at an enemy where you couldn't previously get at them before, but they take the destructible environments far enough that it actually becomes a problem with regards to being able to actually defend yourself adequately. If you can't get any cover because the entire map's been flattened, then it becomes a matter of spawning and then almost instantly dying, which gets pretty infuriating. And it only gets more infuriating when you realize the maps were really not designed for the actual player count. On PC you get 32 players, on console you get 24. And you can pretty easily tell that the maps were designed more for 24 players than they were for 32. Because when it gets to the full servers on PC, it can get pretty messy at times. And when you play on a server that's 24 players instead, it ends up working out a bit better. But regardless of which number of players server you're on, you're going to run into some other issues as well. If you play squad deathmatch, for example, it ends up being just a complete nightmare because you'll spawn and pretty much instantly die from someone who was camping or someone who just happened to be there right when you spawned on top of them. It gets rather infuriating, and frankly the squad deathmatch mode is clearly just a throwaway mode that they put in here because people asked for some sort of deathmatch mode, because it's pretty painfully obvious the game is not designed for it at all, and it really works best when there are actual objectives that you're working for as a team, as opposed to just going in to try to get as many kills as possible for your squad. Hell, if anything, I'd say deathmatch actually fosters the exact wrong idea for a Battlefield game, which is to just not really work as a team and just run off and go guns blazing. The modes that will have you working as a team, on the other hand, are Rush and Conquest, which are, of course, holdovers from the previous Battlefield games, Rush, of course, being an adaptation of Gold Rush from Bad Company, and Conquest being the traditional mode of the Battlefield series. The thing is, unlike in Bad Company, where the game was very clearly designed around the Rush mode entirely, Bad Company 2 actually supports the Conquest mode pretty properly, and the maps are actually pretty intuitive for it, so it ends up actually working out pretty well in the game's favor, partly because the rush mode really isn't that great. Like I said before, the vehicles being able to destroy MCOM stations by collapsing the buildings is a pretty significant problem, and it leads to more irritation than anything else, because you're dealing with a mode that has one team having infinite spawns and having to defend these MCOM stations, and if they lose those two MCOM stations, they have to move back to the next portion of the map and repeat until they get to the last portion of the map. And the other team, the attacking team, has a limited ticket count, and it takes a pretty long time for that count to go down when you get down to it, at least unless the attacking team is basically running around like chickens with their heads cut off, because it's pretty easy to get on the offensive in that mode. Where the game really heats up is the Conquest mode, and again, that's the traditional mode for Battlefield, in which you capture various points around the map and you try to hold them as long as possible in order to speed up the depletion of the enemy's ticket count. Every respawn counts as a ticket, and so when the enemy runs out of tickets, you win, or if you run out of tickets, you lose. This is where you're going to find the most intense firefights, as well as the biggest use of combined arms warfare. The maps are bigger scale, there's usually more buildings on them, there's a lot more vehicles available. It's Battlefield, really. And you can work together with your squad of up to 4, and your team as well, in order to capture these various points and hold them as long as possible, and try to keep the enemy from, of course, doing the same. And here's the thing, when everything is firing on all cylinders, when your team is actually working together really well, when there's a lot of communication going on, and you're seeing a lot of clever use of combined arms warfare, and you're seeing a lot of push and having to retreat and such like that, that is where the game really shines, because that's actually fun. But the problem is that rarely happens. Instead of having these teams working together really well, you get a bunch of people who basically have no idea what they're doing, running around like chickens with their heads cut off, playing it like Call of Duty, or at least attempting to play it like Call of Duty. And while you do have some people who are trying to work as a team and trying to work as squads, it ultimately ends up being more of a mess than anything else, particularly considering how ridiculously easy it is to pen an enemy team in, and just have them being subject to ridiculous amounts of tank fire and helicopter spamming and such like that. And when you combine that with the blatant unbalancing that's in this game, and especially the netcode, which can be really infuriating, and they never fixed it until Battlefield 4, where you can have enemies kill you and then you kill them simultaneously because the lag compensation is a complete disaster in this game, then it becomes a game that only shines every so often. But when it does shine, it's a lot of fun. And unfortunately, this is the last game in the Battlefield series where I really get the vibe that they were actually trying to make that Battlefield formula work. When you get to Battlefield 3 and 4, you get further and further into completely unbalanced unlock systems. The number of players that run around like headless chickens is dramatically increased, and it just ultimately becomes a complete mess. And I really do feel that Bad Company 2 was the tipping point for that. Prior to Battlefield Bad Company, Battlefield was primarily a PC-centric series, and with that came a different kind of player. Back in the Battlefield 2 days and earlier, people were a lot more willing to work as a team, people were a lot more patient. And at least back in those days, it was a relatively happy coexistence between it and Call of Duty. Call of Duty offered the much more arcade experience, while Battlefield offered a true combined arms experience that was a bit slower and more methodical. And then you get to the Bad Company era, and it starts to kind of directly compete with Call of Duty. And honestly, I think that was ultimately the series' downfall. Sure, the sales numbers are high, and that's of course padding EA's pockets up the wazoo, but apparently the cost of that is losing what made Battlefield 2 and, I guess to a lesser degree, 2142 and Battlefield 1942 stand out so much. Don't get me wrong, there's still some of that to be found in this series, but the last game where it popped up pretty regularly was this one, Bad Company 2. Overall, it's pretty hard to get past the problems in Battlefield Bad Company 2 now in order to actually be able to get at that excellent Battlefield experience, but it's so few and far between, especially now that the player base has diminished so much and the server count has diminished to the point where most of the servers remaining are just pretty much 24/7 insert single map here servers and such like that. And even sadder is the demise of Battlefield Bad Company 2 Vietnam, which admittedly is little more than a skin pack for Bad Company 2, but the only ways to get it now are to get it when it's bundled with Bad Company 2 in the pack that they sell. I think it's the Ultimate Collection or something along those lines. or you can get it through Origin for $15, and there's barely anyone playing it, if any. I mean, it makes sense. It's pretty much just a reskin, but since I don't have it, and I'm not really going to bother picking it up, there's no reason for me to cover that. So as far as Bad Company 2 itself goes, I give it a 2.5 out of 5. Yes, that is lower than my original score, but only by half a point. Mostly the half a point has been deducted thanks to me now having actually played the original Bad Company and seen that they didn't really fix all that many of the problems from the original Bad Company. They just fixed a few of them, and some of them they only mitigated a bit. So at least it's better than that, but when you get down to it, this game is more frustrating than it is enjoyable. And ultimately, that's what really drags it down from being that 3 out of 5 that I gave it before, down to the 2.5 out of 5 that it is currently. Although I do have to admit, the issues it has running on modern systems certainly did not work out in the game's favor. Thanks for watching.